Tanse, Atlanite, Ani, Bonjour. Welcome back to Our Shared Politics. My name is Nova. I am a settler on Turtle Island. I created this podcast with the hope of highlighting our similarities amongst political parties instead of focusing on the differences and pushing people further apart. I wish to express acknowledgement that I am on Treaty 8 territory, home to the Tetsikane, Deneza, Nahiawak, Saulteaux, and BC Métis. It is essential I recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, both status and non-status, as the guardians of these lands. As a non-Indigenous person, I play a role as a treaty partner being represented by the government. My pronouns are she, her, but I also accept they, them, and I fall under the 2S LGBTQIA+ umbrella. Last episode, we went over Treaties 1 through 10 and the first 44 years of the post-Confederation federally funded residential school system, which saw the opening of approximately 75 institutions just in those first 44 years. Today, we're going to go over Canada's role and participation in both world wars, beginning in 1912 and ending in 1948, actually 1950, at the end of William Lyon Mackenzie King's final term. This is actually like my fourth time recording this. It's been a learning process for sure, but we're just going to jump right into it today. In 1911, Robert Borden won the federal election, leading to the first Conservative victory in 15 years. He campaigned on the fears of American influence, leading to British disloyalty due to the trade market that Laurier had opened with the U.S., and his slogan had been Canadianism, not continentalism. In 1912, the provinces of Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec were expanded, taking up the southern portion of the Northwest Territories. In 1914, Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, who furthered Macdonald's legacy to new repressive levels of assimilation, said this about the residential school system. Quote, "The system was open to criticism. Insufficient care was exercised in the admission of children to the schools. The well-known predisposition of Indians to tuberculosis resulted in a very large percentage of deaths among the pupils. They were housed in buildings not carefully designed for school purposes, and these buildings became infected and dangerous to the inmates. It is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein." End quote. Notice how he speaks of the children as inmates. In late July 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. The British declaration of war on August 4th, 1914, automatically brought Canada into the war. On August 22, 1914, Parliament passed the War Measures Act, which gave the government extraordinary emergency powers, including the right to censor communications, right to arrest, detain, and deport without trial, right to control transportation, and the right to seize private property. In December 1914, after creating the Canadian Expeditionary Force, Borden stated, quote, "There has not been, there will not be conscription," end quote, as voluntary forces were enlisting in large numbers. Prior to this, there had been the Canadian Militia, which was only about 3,110 men strong. By July 1915, however, there were 150,000 voluntary soldiers, nurses, and chaplains, increasing to 250,000 in October 1915, before peaking to 600,000 in July 1916. Generally, BIPOC were not welcomed into the military. When Black people in Nova Scotia attempted to enlist, they were turned away and told, "This is not for you fellows, this is a white man's war." Eventually, segregated battalions were formed. In total, about 3,500 Indigenous people served in the 114th Battalion, and over 1,000 Black soldiers formed the No. 2 Construction Battalion. After the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Canada was in desperate need to replenish its supply of soldiers, and there were very few volunteers left. This caused the Canadian government to turn to its only remaining option, conscription. And on August 29, 1917, the Military Service Act was passed, allowing the government to conscript men aged 20 to 45 across the country. Weeks later, the Military Voters Act allowed all 400,000 remaining Canadian soldiers, including those who were underage and born in Britain, to vote, and also allowed current and former Indigenous veterans to vote. This act also allowed female relatives, excluding Indigenous women, to vote. This was done to solidify political support for conscription, as the overseas soldiers and their families were in favor. However, this law confiscated the right to vote from German and Austrian immigrants who had moved to Canada after 1902, as they were from enemy nations. Between 1914 and 1920, more than 8,500 Austro-Hungarian Canadians were interned in labour camps, with the vast majority being Ukrainian. They worked in the national parks of Western Canada, building roads, clearing bush, and cutting trails. All of their personal wealth and property was confiscated. At least 107 internees died. 6 were shot while trying to escape, while the others died from disease, overwork, dangerous conditions, and suicide. 80,000 other Ukrainian Canadians were not imprisoned, but registered as enemy aliens and forced to report regularly to the police. Duncan Campbell Scott is quoted in 1916 as having said, quote, "The purpose of the amendment to the Act was to prevent the Indians from being exploited as a savage or semi-savage race when the whole of the administrative force of the department is endeavoring to civilize them." End quote. In 1916, the government actually introduced a 4-year business profits war tax to address businesses that were practicing war profiteering. The tax was then later brought back for the Second World War. I think it's interesting that we already had war profiteering going on in 1916. The finance minister had rejected calls for direct taxation on Canadian citizens, assuming that Britain would cover the costs incurred by Canada. However, by 1916, Britain was not even able to pay for their wartime shipments from Canada, let alone lend any money. This led to Borden negotiating loans from America. By 1917, the government began to reverse their anti-taxation position, as wartime savings bonds and raising import tariffs had not been enough. The income tax came into effect on September 20th, 1917. It exempted the first $1,500 for single people and $3,000 for everyone else. Single people were taxed at 4%, while the tax rate ranged from 2 to 22% for married Canadians with dependents and an annual income of over $6,000 at the highest end. Luxury taxes on tobacco and alcohol were introduced, and taxes on tickets, telegrams, money orders, checks, and medicines were introduced. By the end of the war, staple items were even taxed, and $8 million in income tax had been collected. But that was a small fraction of the national net debt of $1.6 billion. Though the income tax had been declared temporary, it's remained in place ever since. 11 days before the 1917 federal election, the Halifax explosion was set off. The blast killed nearly 1,800 people. A ship loaded with high explosives caught fire after French and Norwegian vessels collided. It was the largest human-made explosion at the time, releasing roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. Nearly all the structures within a 1-kilometer radius were obliterated, with the pressure waves snapping trees, bending iron rails, and scattering fragments of the ship for kilometers. Across the harbor, there was also widespread damage. A tsunami was created by the blast, wiping out a Mi'kmaq community that had lived in the cove for generations. Borden sent $30 million for medical care, repairing infrastructure, and establishing pensions for those injured. On May 24, 1918, white and black female citizens over the age of 21 were granted the right to vote. Indigenous and Asian Canadian men and women were still forbidden. On November 11, 1918, World War I ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. After the war, the working class was experiencing economic hardship. Construction and metal workers in Winnipeg, Manitoba, sought better wages and working conditions. In May 1919, several strikes started, and on May 15th, a general strike was called for. Within hours, nearly 30,000 workers resigned. Afraid that this would spark in other cities, the government threatened to fire federal workers who did not immediately return to work. They also allowed the deportation of British-born immigrants. On June 21st, the Conservative government deployed troops from the Northwest Mounted Police to the strike scene to maintain order. As a result, the protest turned into a riot. The Northwest Mounted Police charged at the protesters, beat them with clubs, and fired bullets. 2 people were killed, and the incident became known as Bloody Saturday. Duncan Campbell Scott said in 1920, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department," end quote. And the very next year again, quote, "It has always been clear to me that the Indians must have some sort of recreation, and if our agents would endeavor to substitute reasonable amusements for this senseless drumming and dancing, it would be a great assistance." Yeah. In 1920, the Northwest Mounted Police became known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and that year, Borden resigned due to old age, and his fellow Conservative, Arthur Meighen, took over. He was Prime Minister for just 18 months, and during this time, Treaty 11 was signed. Treaty 11 was signed on June 27, 1921, by the Dene, Tlichon, Gwich'in, and Sato peoples of the Northwest Territories. As with the other treaties, the government had no interest in signing with the peoples of the region until it would benefit the government. When oil prospects were discovered in the Mackenzie region, interests were sparked. The reserves were allotted in much the same way as the last treaties, 640 acres per family of 5, with the government being allowed to take parts for public works whenever they saw fit. Once the reserves were doled out, each band received 10 axes, 5 handsaws, 5 augers, 1 grindstone, and files and whetstones. Each family received a one-time bundle of $50 worth of fishing, trapping, and hunting equipment, as well as $3 annually for other necessary supplies. Much like in Treaty 10, the government prepared the terms in advance to be imposed upon the Indigenous peoples rather than a true negotiation. According to witnesses, the first signatory was hesitant to sign, having heard about the Nahiawak in the south being placed on reserves and prevented from hunting. The Catholic missionary's diary cryptically records that, quote, "The Indians have no desire to accept the treaty," end quote, yet just 3 days later it states, quote, "The last of the Indians has accepted the treaty," end quote. There was definitely no fair negotiations going on there. The boundary between Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 is vague, as the Yellowknives Dene First Nation is a signatory to Treaty 8, but according to the text of the treaties is within Treaty 11. Many of the treaties have had comprehensive land claims, with some still ongoing, with Justice Thomas Berger noting in his Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry of 1977, quote, "The settlement of native claims is not a mere transaction. It would be wrong, therefore, to think that signing a piece of paper would put the whole question behind us," end quote. In 1921, the Liberal William Lyon Mackenzie King became the 10th Prime Minister. He served 3 non-consecutive terms for a total of 21 years and 154 days in office, and remains the longest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history. Old MacDonald truly walked so King could run. Between the two of them, they served for a combined total of 40 years. When Canada is only 156 years old, that's a huge portion of our history, and their extended times in office are still heavily reflected in policies today. In the 1920s, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia began a course of systemic sterilization of Indigenous women, which spread across Canada. Victims were threatened, misinformed about the necessities and effects, and in some cases, consent was just simply not requested at all. These practices are still ongoing today. King's government passed the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, effectively banning Chinese immigration to Canada. Immigration from most countries was controlled in some way, but only the Chinese were completely prohibited. This was due to BC putting pressure on the federal government. That same year, former subjects of Austria-Hungary and Ukraine were once again allowed to enter Canada. It's funny how during times of war is the only time that like white immigrants are ever being persecuted or being targeted, is like literally when there's a fucking world war going on. All of a sudden we're targeting any sort of white or European immigrant. In 1926, a corruption scandal was uncovered, and King asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and call another election. The Governor General declined, however, and asked the leader of the opposition to form government, even though they were not a majority in the slightest. Weeks later, they were defeated on a motion of non-confidence, triggering an election anyways. With that election in 1926, Meighen won again, or I guess he won for the first time since Borden had just retired last time, and he was prime minister again for about 3 months before King was returned to power. Lots happened that year on Parliament Hill, apparently. Throughout this next term, King led Canada from a dominion with a responsible government to an autonomous nation within the Commonwealth. He increased the powers of the provincial governments by transferring them the ownership of crown lands within their borders, as well as the subsoil rights, which became important when petroleum and everything took off. He reduced the sales and income taxes and removed the transportation taxes. The Combines Investigation Act of 1923 was passed and aimed at safeguarding consumers and producers from exploitation due to commercial monopolies. Where'd that go? And also the Fair Wages and 8 Hours Day Act in 1930. King was in power at the beginning of the Great Depression, but slow to respond, and critics felt he was out of touch. King had carelessly remarked just prior to the election that year that he, quote, would not even give a 5-cent piece, end quote, to Tory provincial governments for unemployment relief. The Conservatives were then able to turn this quote into a catchphrase and thus lost him the 1930 election. Conservative R.B. Bennett was made Prime Minister and appointed himself both Finance Minister and External Affairs Minister. He worked an exhausting hour throughout his tenure, often more than 14 hours a day, and lived in a suite in a hotel that was a short walk from Parliament Hill. When responding to letters from citizens talking about struggles, he wrote back with personal notes and cash tucked into the envelopes. I've never heard of that from a politician today. However, during the Depression, the government as a whole provided very little relief to the millions of increasingly desperate and agitated unemployed citizens. The Conservative Party adopted a laissez-faire attitude and thought that, quote, government relief to the unemployed was considered a disincentive to individual initiative, end quote, and therefore granted only the most minimal amounts of unemployment relief. The government was concerned, however, with the numbers of unemployed men now concentrating in urban centers, which was creating volatile situations. As a, quote, alternative to bloodshed on the streets, end quote, the stopgap solution was to establish military-run and styled relief camps in remote areas where unemployed single men toiled for 20 cents a day, which today is $4.62 a day for like hard manual labor. Also, funny that that's their alternative and not just bringing in more unemployment so that people won't be gathering in the streets because they're starving and they're watching their family starve. Outside of all of this, all relief was left to the provincial governments, many of which were on the brink of bankruptcy. Now we're back to the government we know today. Finally, a final quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, before leaving his position in 1931, wrote, quote, "It is the opinion of the writer that the government will in time reach the end of its responsibility as the Indians progress into civilization and finally disappear as a separate and distinct people, not by race extinction, but by gradual assimilation with their fellow citizens," end quote. Which, that's essentially race extinction, is it not? In 1932, Bennett gave an anti-communist speech which earned him the nickname Iron Heel Bennett, and he invoked the Section 98 of the Criminal Code, dispensing with the presumption of innocence. This meant that anyone belonging to the Communist Party of Canada or anyone who attended meetings, spoke in defense of such organizations, or even read the literature could be incarcerated. By 1933, unemployment was at an all-time high of 27%, and over 1.5 million Canadians were dependent on relief. The federal government launched public works projects to create employment. They were labor camps again with the same conditions as before. Due to these poor conditions, the Communist Party of Canada was able to get in there and organize camp workers and form the Camp Workers Union. That's what happens when the governments just let us starve. In January 1934, Bennett told the provinces that they were, quote, wasteful and extravagant, end quote, and that they were wealthy enough to manage their own problems. Exactly 1 year later, however, in January 1935, he changed his tune after seeing President Roosevelt's New Deal in the USA. In a series of live radio speeches broadcast to the nation, Bennett introduced progressive income taxation, a minimum wage, a maximum number of working hours per week, unemployment insurance, health insurance, no, not universal health care, a pension program, and grants to farmers. This meant the end of laissez-faire. Bennett's conversion was too little too late, however, and his reforms did not go far enough. Car owners, who could not afford gasoline, had horses pull their vehicles, which they nicknamed Bennett buggies. And you can Google Bennett buggies and you can see them, and it's a good reflection of like what it was like in the Great Depression. In June 1935, the communist camp workers called a strike and protested for 2 months in Vancouver before the On to Ottawa trek began. About 1,000 strikers climbed onto boxcars and took the railway eastbound Ottawa, with demands to raise wages, workmen's comp coverage, all military control be abolished in the camps, and that all workers be given the right to vote. The protesters reached Regina, Saskatchewan a few weeks later. While there, the RCMP charged the crowd with batons from all 4 sides and used tear gas and fired guns. The RCMP blocked the roadways, resulting in a 6-hour battle. When it was over, 140 trekkers had been arrested and 2 men had died, with hundreds more sustaining injuries. Hospital records were altered to conceal the causes of death. Those who sought medical help later on were then arrested. One of the trekkers who was arrested was able to get word to Saskatchewan's premier somehow, who then sent a wire to the Prime Minister accusing him and the RCMP of precipitating a riot when they should have been negotiating a settlement. These events led to discredit the Conservatives, and in the 1935 election, they lost. Finally, we're on to William Lyon Mackenzie King's third and final term in power. For the first time, he led an undisputed Liberal majority government with a newfound commitment to the underprivileged, speaking of a new era where, quote, poverty and adversity, want and misery are the enemies which liberalism will seek to banish from the land, end quote. Over the next 13 years, a wide range of social reforms came to Canada, which including introducing family allowances in 1944, which he strongly argued, quote, would mean better food, clothing, and medical and dental care for children in low-income families, end quote. So now that we've set him up as a seemingly great man, we're going to tear that all down. In 1937, King visited Nazi Germany and met with Adolf Hitler. To give some context for that date exactly, 5 years prior, the labor camp Dachau was opened on March 22nd, 1933. This was before it was turned into a full-fledged death camp, but it was known what was going on. King had a weird religious yearning for insight into the mysteries of life and believed that Hitler was akin to mythical Wagnerian heroes within whom good and evil were struggling. Or, as a National Post headline put it so eloquently in 2017, quote, the Prime Minister with a man crush for Hitler, end quote. King thought that good would eventually triumph and that Hitler would lead his people to harmony. And he, King, wanted to be the one that led Hitler to peace. He commented in his journal, quote, He is really one who truly loves his fellow men and his country, and would make any sacrifice for their good, end quote, and forecast, quote, the world will yet come to see a very great man mystic in Hitler. I cannot abide in Nazism, the regimentation, cruelty, oppression of Jews, attitude towards religion, but Hitler will rank some day with Joan of Arc among the deliverers of his people. End quote. Yeah, he truly loves his fellow men as long as they were Aryan. Under King's administration, the Canadian government, responding to strong public opinion, especially in Quebec, refused Jewish refugees from Europe. In June 1939, Canada, along with Cuba and the US, turned away 907 Jewish refugees aboard a passenger ship. When an immigration official in King's party was asked how many Jewish refugees Canada would admit after World War II, he replied, quote, none is too many, end quote, which was wholly supported by King and his allies. The ship was forced to return to Europe, where 254 of its passengers were murdered in the Holocaust. Just months later, Poland was invaded, and the final solution of the Jewish question officially began, and Canada mobilized on September 1st, 1939. On September 10th, Canada declared war against Germany. After Hitler's election, Great Britain had admitted tens of thousands of mostly German and Austrian Jewish refugees. However, once the war was declared, Great Britain declared them and all persons from Axis countries enemy aliens. Britain asked Canada and Australia to accept this group of foreign nationals, I think probably to get them off the continent, and so they wouldn't be much risk. In the summer of 1940, more than 3,000 of these refugees were sent to Canada. They were immediately interned and became known as, quote, accidental immigrants, end quote. They were interned with prisoners of war, including actual Nazi POWs. Senior Canadian officials apparently realized that this wasn't safe, and separate camps were eventually established. Canada had been largely ignored by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite Canada's major role in supplying food, raw material, munitions, and money to the hard-pressed British economy, training airmen for the Commonwealth, guarding the western half of the North Atlantic Ocean from German U-boats, and providing troops for the invasions of France, Italy, and Germany. While Canada even hosted 2 major Allied conferences, King was never invited to take part in any discussion, which, knowing his past with Hitler, yeah, I can see why they maybe didn't care to hear his opinion or care to hear what he had to say. On July 11th, 1941, a letter from the federal government instructed all local Indian agents to submit all passes to Ottawa to be destroyed and began to phase out the Indigenous pass system. I did read, though, that it took years for it to phase out. It wasn't an overnight thing, and it was worse, I believe, in the Prairie provinces. It took even longer to phase out. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese Canadians were deemed enemy aliens and personal rights were removed. In total, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were expelled from BC starting in 1942, of whom 14,000 had been born in Canada. A 100-mile wide strip along the Pacific coast was deemed protected, and all men of Japanese origin were forcibly relocated to east of the Rocky Mountains. This comprised of over 90% of the total Japanese Canadian population at the time. Over half of Japanese Canadians, more than 12,000 people, were then interned in largely abandoned mining towns. The Canadian government confiscated and sold their property and would go on to pressure around 4,000 of them to accept mass deportation when the war ended. In comparison, of the approximately 600,000 German Canadians, only around 850 were interned, and it was because they were actually members of the Canadian Nazi Party, or they were suspected of spying. Approximately 600 of the 31,000 Italian Canadians were also interned. You can just see the disparity between those two numbers. 90% of Japanese Canadians versus 850 out of 600,000 German Canadians. In March 1942, Canadian nutrition experts led human experiments using Indigenous children from residential schools in Alberta, BC, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Ontario. Children were put on what is essentially a starvation diet and then slowly reintroduced to find the baseline of nutritional requirement for humans. Children were fed experimental fortified flour mixture, despite it being a federally banned substance at the time, basically to see what the effects were and whether legalization could happen. This experimental mixture included substances like bone meal and resulted in increased anemia among the children who were fed it. Certain children were given vitamins and supplements, while others were not, like control subjects. These experiments then went on to become what we know today as Canada's Food Guide, and that is so sick. We learned about the food guide starting in like elementary school and learned it all the way up to like grade 10, probably grade 9, something like that. Never once mentioned. It is disgusting. I can't believe it. I can't believe that while, Unit 731, and while fucking Mangala and all of them were going on, we were doing our own human experiments. On June 10th, 1942, William Lyon Mackenzie King said in the House of Commons that his policy is, quote, not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary, end quote. In November 1944, the government decided it was necessary to send conscripts for the war. This led to a brief mutiny, but the war ended only a few months later. By 1947, only 5,000 Jewish refugees had been permitted to enter Canada in the last 15 years. This was the poorest admission record among Western countries. At the end of the war, King retired and Louis St. Laurent took over as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada before winning the 1948 federal election. He strongly advocated against communism and was an enthusiastic proponent of Canada joining NATO in 1949 to fight the spread of communism, which at this point, every time I hear anything from that time area and all these people talking about how, like, the Red Scare and everything, I don't get why they were so scared of communism and not of fascism. Well, I do. I understand why. But just the fact that they're two sides of the same coin. Like, communism as we've seen it done in, like, China and Russia and places like that, obviously not good examples of communism, not what we're ever trying to get to or anything. But it's not like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany or Japan or any of the Axis countries are great either. But we never had like a fascist scare, and we never had like people don't hate fascists nearly as much as they hate communists. And I don't get it. Like, the brainwashing's worked, man. It's worked. The fact that people, they're first, like, it's worse to be called a fat or a communist than a fascist. At least to, like, right-wing people. I guess it makes sense, but I don't know. If you're gonna go after one ideological or like political ideology, go after all of them. If you're gonna go after communism, go after fascism, and go after it just as hard. Like, McCarthy down in the States never got hell bent out on fascism like he did communism. It's just hypocrisy. In 1949, Newfoundland and Labrador finally joined Canada, becoming the 10th and final province. Before this, the territory had been the Dominion of Newfoundland, and it was actually settled before even the 13 colonies and like the Mayflower and everything down in the States. And yeah, there's a really rich history with Newfoundland itself. In 1950, William Lyon Mackenzie King died after a bout of pneumonia. and playing the world's tiniest violin. During his life, King had kept very candid diaries, beginning in 1893 when he was an undergrad to just a few days before his death in 1950, which is like 57 years. That's crazy. The volumes spanned a length of over 7 meters and comprise over 50,000 pages when transcribed. His occult practices had been kept secret while in office, but it turns out he paid mediums to conduct seances where he claimed to have conversations with Leonardo da Vinci, his dead mother, several of his dead dogs, and the spirit of FDR. And if you've been keeping up on any sort of the international politics, Argentina just elected a chainsaw wielding madman as their president, prime minister, whatever they have. And I guess he gets a lot of his political ideas and political positions from a psychic who tells him what his dead dog is wants to pass, the messages his dead dog wants to pass on. And I guess they're mostly political. So Argentina's actually got a dead dog for a president. Weird. Seems like we had Leonardo da Vinci, a dead mother, several dead dogs, in the spirit of FDR, though, as our prime minister. So, cool. Between 1911 and 1950, approximately 29 residential schools had been built. This brought the total residential schools in Canada to around 104. As always, thank you for joining me today. I drop a new episode every Monday morning at midnight, so check back in next week to find out what I'll be sharing with you then. If you or a loved one you know uses drugs, please keep in mind that you can call 1-888-688-6677 to contact the National Overdose Response Services to access support while using, and especially using alone, please. And there's also the Brave app that you can download on your phone with a use alone timer that connects you to a paramedic if you don't respond. Everyone, please consider picking up a free naloxone kit and keep it on hand 24/7. If you're unaware of where you can pick one up, simply Google naloxone kit plus your province. If you learned something new today, it'd be awesome if you'd click that button and follow along for next time. Or if you'd like to contact me with feedback, you can email me at oursharedpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.